It was a typical Saturday afternoon at the bustling Crystal Haven Mall, filled with families enjoying their weekend, teens wandering around with friends, and shoppers exploring the various stores. The atmosphere was vibrant, filled with laughter and the general hum of a busy shopping center. Among the shoppers was Ben Wallace, an accomplished businessman in his late 40s. Ben had recently acquired the mall as part of his growing real estate portfolio, and today he was visiting his new property in an unannounced, low-key manner, dressed casually in jeans, a t-shirt, and a red MAGA hat. Ben intended to observe the operations firsthand. As Ben strolled through the mall, admiring the businesses and the busy crowd, he couldn't help but notice some people giving him curious glances, their eyes lingering on his bright red hat. Unfazed, Ben continued his walk, pleased to see how well the mall was operating. Meanwhile, Laura Williams, a shopper, spotted Ben and felt an immediate surge of discomfort at the sight of his hat. To her, it symbolized everything she opposed, and she became increasingly agitated. Unable to let it go, she approached a nearby mall security guard, demanding action against Ben. What Laura and the staff didn't know was that they were about to make a decision they would regret, one that involved not just any shopper, but the new owner of the entire mall. Before we dive into this dramatic story of mistaken identity, consequences, and valuable lessons, hit that like button, subscribe, and let us know in the comments. Have you ever faced a situation where people made wrong assumptions about you? It all started with Laura Williams, her eyes narrowing as she spotted Ben Wallace strolling through Crystal Haven Mall. To Laura, the sight of the red MAGA hat he wore was more than just a piece of clothing. It was a symbol that made her uncomfortable, a representation of beliefs she vehemently opposed. She couldn't just stand by while something she saw as divisive was paraded around the mall she frequented. Without hesitation, Laura decided she had to act. Laura approached Officer Mike Carson, a mall security guard who was stationed near the food court. Mike was known for his easygoing attitude and his tendency to avoid confrontation whenever possible. Today, however, Laura was determined to test his patience. "Excuse me, officer," Laura began, her tone urgent and her brow furrowed. "That man over there," she said, pointing toward Ben, "his hat is offensive. It's making people uncomfortable. You need to make him leave." Her voice was filled with indignation, and she clearly expected immediate action. Mike followed her gaze and saw Ben, who was casually browsing at a nearby kiosk. He looked back at Laura, a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. "Ma'am, I don't think wearing a hat is against the rules," he said carefully. He tried to keep his voice calm, hoping to diffuse the tension, but he could already sense that Laura wasn't going to be satisfied with that answer. Laura crossed her arms, her voice rising slightly as she spoke. "It's not just a hat, it's a political statement, and it's making people like me feel unsafe. You need to do something about it." Her eyes flashed with determination, and it was clear that she wasn't going to let this go without a fight. Mike sighed inwardly. He could tell this was not going to be an easy situation to diffuse. He didn't want to escalate things, but Laura's insistence left him with few options. He decided to approach Ben, hoping that a polite request might resolve the matter without further escalation. He knew that any misstep could turn the situation into a bigger problem. Mike walked over to where Ben was standing, taking a moment to steady himself before speaking. "Excuse me, sir," he said, his tone as respectful as possible. "I'm going to have to ask you to remove your hat or leave the premises. We've had some complaints." He spoke slowly, carefully choosing his words, trying to convey that he was just doing his job. Ben turned to face the security guard, his expression calm but questioning. "Complaints about what?" he asked. "It's just a hat." His voice was even, but there was an edge of disbelief in his tone. He couldn't understand why anyone would be so bothered by what he was wearing. Mike shifted uncomfortably. "Some people find it offensive, sir," he explained, glancing over his shoulder at Laura, who was watching the interaction with a look of expectation. Mike could feel the pressure mounting. Laura's eyes were practically boring into his back, and he knew she was waiting for him to take action. Ben raised an eyebrow. "Do you have a policy against political clothing?" he asked, his voice steady. He wasn't angry, just curious. He had every right to be in the mall, and he knew it. He wasn't causing a disturbance, and he certainly wasn't breaking any rules that he was aware of. Mike hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I'm not sure about that, sir," he admitted, "but I've been asked to address the complaint." He could feel the tension building between them, and he knew that whatever he said next would be crucial. He wanted to avoid conflict, but Laura's persistence made that difficult. Ben shook his head slightly, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. "Well, I'm not leaving. I've done nothing wrong. I'd like to see the mall's policies if that's what you're basing this on," he said firmly. His voice carried a calm authority, and it was clear that he wasn't going to be intimidated into leaving without a valid reason. Mike could feel the tension building, and he knew he was out of his depth. He reached for his radio, calling for backup. He hoped that a second officer might be able to help de-escalate the situation. Within a few minutes, Officer Jenny Lopez arrived at the scene. Jenny was known for her no-nonsense approach, and as she approached, her eyes narrowed at the sight of Ben's hat. She could sense that this was not going to be an easy situation to handle. "What's going on here?" Mike asked, her voice clipped. She could tell from the look on Mike's face that things had already gotten complicated. She didn't like dealing with situations like this, but it was part of the job. Mike quickly filled her in, explaining Laura's complaint and Ben's refusal to comply. Jenny turned her attention to Ben, her stance assertive. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you again to remove the hat or leave the mall," she said. "We're trying to maintain a comfortable environment for everyone." Her tone was firm, and it was clear that she wasn't in the mood for negotiation. Ben met her gaze, his expression unchanged. "I'm not breaking any rules," he said calmly. "I'd like to speak with the person in charge." His voice was steady, and there was a quiet confidence in his words. He wasn't backing down, and he wasn't about to let anyone push him around. Jenny exchanged a glance with Mike, her frustration evident. She could tell that Ben wasn't going to budge, and she knew that this was quickly becoming a situation that was beyond their authority. "Sir, we're going to have to escalate this if you don't comply," she warned, her voice carrying a note of finality. Ben crossed his arms, standing his ground. "Then escalate it. Let's see what your higher-ups have to say." His tone was unwavering, and it was clear that he wasn't afraid of whatever consequences they might threaten him with. Jenny sighed, reaching for her radio to call the mall manager. The situation was quickly becoming more complicated than she had anticipated, and she knew they were going to need someone with more authority to handle it. She shot another glance at Mike, who shrugged helplessly. It was clear that they were both in over their heads, and it was time to bring in someone who could make the final call. It didn't take long for the mall manager, Sarah Green, to arrive at the scene. She had been in her office dealing with some paperwork when she received the call from Jenny. Frustrated by the interruption, Sarah left her office, her annoyance evident in her brisk walk to the main concourse. As she approached, she could see a small crowd forming around the security officers and the man in the red hat. She sighed heavily. This was exactly the kind of situation she didn't want to deal with on a busy Saturday afternoon. When Sarah reached the scene, Laura was the first to approach her. "Are you the manager?" Laura asked, her voice filled with indignation. Without waiting for a response, she continued, "This man is causing a disturbance. His hat is offensive, and he refuses to leave. Something needs to be done." Sarah nodded curtly, her eyes scanning the situation. She turned her attention to Mike and Jenny, who both seemed a bit flustered. Finally, she looked at Ben, who stood calmly, his arms crossed and an unreadable expression on his face. "Sir," Sarah began, addressing Ben, "we've received several complaints about your hat. It's making some of our shoppers uncomfortable, and we need you to either remove it or leave the premises." Her tone was firm, leaving little room for negotiation. Ben met her gaze evenly. "I've already explained to your security officers that I've done nothing wrong," he said. "I'm just here to shop. I'd like to see the policy that says I can't wear a hat like this in your mall." Sarah's patience was wearing thin. She had other things to do, and the last thing she needed was a confrontation over a hat. "We don't need a specific policy, sir," she said, her tone turning colder. "Our job is to ensure this mall is a safe and welcoming environment for everyone. If your presence is making people uncomfortable, we have the right to ask you to leave." Ben tilted his head slightly, a hint of a smile on his face. "A welcoming environment for everyone?" he repeated. "It seems like it's not very welcoming to people who have different opinions." His voice was calm, but there was an edge to his words that suggested he wasn't going to back down easily. Laura, who had been standing to the side, couldn't hold back any longer. She stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. "You're just here to stir up trouble," she snapped. "People like you think you can just shove your beliefs in everyone's face, and it's not right." Ben turned his attention to Laura, his expression still calm. "People like me?" he echoed. "All I'm doing is shopping. I'm not bothering anyone. You're the one who approached security because you don't like what I'm wearing." Sarah held up her hand, trying to regain control of the situation. "Enough," she said, her voice sharp. She turned back to Ben. "Sir, I'm asking you one last time. Either remove the hat or leave the mall. If you refuse, we will have no choice but to escort you out." Ben took a deep breath, his eyes locked on Sarah's. "I've done nothing wrong," he repeated. "But if you're determined to make me leave, then go ahead and call security to escort me out. Just know that you're making a big mistake, Miss Green. I hope you're prepared for the consequences." Sarah's eyes narrowed at his words. "Is that a threat?" she asked, her voice tinged with irritation. She was used to dealing with difficult customers, but there was something about Ben's demeanor that unsettled her. He wasn't angry or belligerent. He was calm, almost too calm, and it made her uneasy. "It's not a threat," Ben replied evenly. "It's just a fact. I think you'll regret how you've handled the situation." Sarah shook her head, dismissing his words. She turned to Jenny and Mike, her expression stern. "Escort him out," she ordered. "Make sure he leaves the premises." Jenny and Mike exchanged a glance before stepping forward. Mike gestured for Ben to follow them. "Come on, sir," he said, his voice lacking the confidence it had earlier. He still wasn't entirely sure that what they were doing was right, but he had his orders. Ben nodded, his composure unshaken. "I'll leave," he said, his voice calm. "But remember what I said. You're going to regret this." As Ben turned to leave, the crowd that had gathered began to disperse, murmurs of confusion and curiosity rippling through the onlookers. Laura stood with her arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on her face as she watched Ben walk away. She felt vindicated, as if she had won some kind of moral victory. But Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Sarah watched as Ben was escorted out of the mall, her frustration still simmering beneath the surface. She didn't like being threatened, and she certainly didn't like the idea that this man thought he could challenge her authority. As far as she was concerned, she had done her job. She had addressed a complaint and taken action to maintain the comfort of the mall's patrons. But as she turned to head back to her office, she couldn't help but replay Ben's words in her mind. "You're making a big mistake. You'll regret this." There was something about the way he had said it, something that made her uneasy, but she pushed the thought aside, convincing herself that she had done what was necessary. After all, she was the manager, and it was her responsibility to keep things under control. Still, a nagging doubt lingered, a small voice in the back of her mind that wondered if maybe, just maybe, she had handled things the wrong way. Jenny and Mike returned to their posts, both of them feeling a sense of unease. Mike in particular couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ben than met the eye. He had been so calm, so confident, even as he was being escorted out. It wasn't the reaction Mike was used to seeing from people who were being forced to leave the premises. Usually there was anger, shouting, or at least some sign of frustration. But Ben had been almost composed. It left Mike with an uneasy feeling that maybe they had just made a mistake, a big one. Laura, on the other hand, felt triumphant. She had stood up for what she believed was right, and the man in the red hat had been removed from the mall. To her, it was a victory for decency and respect, but even she couldn't completely ignore the way Ben had carried himself, the calmness in his voice, the way he had spoken to Sarah. It was unsettling, but she quickly brushed it off. She had done what needed to be done, and that was all that mattered. As Ben exited the mall, he glanced back at the building, a thoughtful expression on his face. He had given them every opportunity to do the right thing, and they had chosen poorly. He wasn't angry. If anything, he was disappointed. He knew that there would be consequences for their actions, and he intended to ensure that those consequences were felt. But for now, he walked away calm and composed, knowing that the real confrontation was yet to come. After leaving the mall, Ben returned to his car, his mind already formulating a plan for how to address the situation. He took a deep breath, pulled out his phone, and called his assistant. The call was brief but to the point. Ben wanted the full HR policies for the mall, and he wanted them quickly. He was determined to ensure that those who had wronged him understood the consequences of their actions. The next morning, the mall manager, Sarah Green, and the security team were in for an unpleasant surprise. It began with an email from the corporate office, marked as urgent, instructing them to report to a conference room for an emergency meeting. The tone of the email was severe, leaving Sarah uneasy. She had barely slept the night before, her mind replaying the incident with Ben over and over again. Now, with this sudden meeting, her anxiety only grew. When Sarah, Jenny, and Mike arrived at the conference room, they were met by David Sterling, the regional director who oversaw the operations of Crystal Haven Mall and several other properties owned by the parent company. David's expression was unreadable, but the tension in the room was palpable. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," David began, his voice measured and controlled. He glanced at the security guards and then at Sarah, his gaze lingering on her for a moment longer. "We have a serious matter to discuss regarding an incident that took place here yesterday." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Jenny and Mike exchanged uneasy glances, both of them feeling the weight of David's words. They knew this was about Ben, but they still didn't know the full extent of the situation. David took a deep breath before continuing. "The man you removed from the premises yesterday was not just an ordinary shopper," he said, his tone calm but carrying an edge of disappointment. "That man was Ben Wallace, the new owner of this mall." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah felt her heart drop into her stomach, her face flushing with a mixture of shock and embarrassment. Jenny's eyes widened and Mike's jaw dropped slightly, his worst fears confirmed. David's gaze remained fixed on Sarah as he continued. "Mr. Wallace contacted me directly after the incident. He informed me that he was treated with blatant disrespect and was removed from the mall simply because of a hat. This kind of behavior is not only unprofessional but entirely unacceptable." Sarah opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She felt a cold sweat form on the back of her neck as the gravity of the situation sank in. She had kicked out the owner of the mall. The realization was almost too much to process. "Mr. Wallace has requested that we address this matter immediately," David said, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at Sarah. "And I fully agree with him. There is no room for personal bias when it comes to treating our customers with respect. What happened yesterday was a failure on multiple levels." Sarah finally found her voice, though it was shaky. I didn't know who he was," she stammered, her mind racing for an excuse. "If I had known—" David held up his hand, cutting her off. "It doesn't matter if you knew who he was or not," he said firmly. "Every customer should be treated with respect, regardless of their appearance or personal beliefs. That's the standard we hold ourselves to, and that's the standard Mr. Wallace expects." Jenny and Mike sat silently, both of them unsure of what to say. They had been following orders, but now it was clear that those orders had been misguided. Mike could feel the unease growing in his chest, knowing that they had made a serious mistake. David turned his attention to Jenny and Mike. "As for you two, I understand that you were acting under the direction of your manager," he said. "However, that does not absolve you of your responsibility to uphold our standards. You are security officers, and your job is to ensure the safety and comfort of everyone in this mall. That includes treating all patrons fairly." Jenny nodded, her face flushed with embarrassment. Mike swallowed hard, feeling the weight of David's words. He knew that they had let their personal biases cloud their judgment, and now they were paying the price for it. David's gaze shifted back to Sarah, his expression one of disappointment, and his voice carried a stern edge. "Sarah, as the manager of this mall, you are expected to lead by example. Your actions yesterday were anything but exemplary. Instead of de-escalating the situation, you allowed your personal biases to dictate your behavior. You failed to uphold the company's values, and you failed to provide the leadership that this team needs." Sarah felt her stomach turn as she listened to David's words. She knew what was coming, but she still wasn't ready to hear it. David took a deep breath before delivering the final blow. "Effective immediately, you are terminated from your position as mall manager," he said, his voice firm. "Your conduct was unprofessional and unacceptable, and it has left us with no other choice. Sarah's eyes widened, her face going pale. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words caught in her throat. She felt a wave of panic wash over her as the reality of the situation sank in. She had lost her job, everything she had worked for, gone in an instant. David didn't wait for a response. He turned to Jenny and Mike, his expression softening slightly. As for you two, Mr. Wallace has decided to give you a second chance, he said. You were following orders, and while that does not excuse your actions, it does mitigate them. You will both be required to undergo additional training to ensure that something like this never happens again. Consider this a warning. Any further incidents of this nature will result in immediate termination. Jenny let out a sigh of relief, nodding quickly. Thank you, Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike nodded as well, feeling a mixture of relief and regret. He knew they had been given a second chance, and he was determined not to waste it. David looked around the room, his gaze lingering on each of them for a moment. I hope you all understand the seriousness of this situation, he said. Mr. Wallace expects the highest standards from all of us, and we cannot afford to let personal biases interfere with our work. This mall is meant to be a welcoming place for everyone, and it's our job to ensure that it remains that way. With that, David stood up, signaling that the meeting was over. Sarah remained in her seat, her mind racing as she tried to process everything that had just happened. Jenny and Mike slowly got to their feet, both of them still reeling from the revelation. They had made a mistake, a big one, and now they had to live with the consequences. As they left the conference room, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of bitterness. She had worked hard to become the manager of Crystal Haven Mall, and now it had all been taken away from her because of one mistake. But deep down, she knew that it wasn't just one mistake. It was a series of poor decisions that had led her to this point, and now she had to face the consequences. Jenny and Mike returned to their posts, both of them determined to do better. They knew they had been given a second chance, and they were grateful for it. They also knew that they had a lot to learn, and they were ready to make things right. David watched them leave, his expression thoughtful. He knew that this was just the beginning of the changes that needed to be made at Crystal Haven Mall. Mr. Wallace had made it clear that he expected nothing less than the best from his staff, and David was determined to ensure that those expectations were met. There was still work to be done, but for now the first steps had been taken. The consequences had begun, and David knew that the lessons learned from this incident would resonate throughout the entire staff. It was time to move forward, to rebuild, and to ensure that Crystal Haven Mall truly became a place where everyone felt welcome. As the meeting concluded, Ben Wallace knew that his next steps were crucial for ensuring Crystal Haven Mall was a place where all customers felt respected and welcome. Sitting in his office the next morning, Ben reviewed the HR policies and reflected on the events of the previous day. His disappointment had less to do with the personal disrespect he experienced and more to do with the failure of his staff to uphold the values that he believed in, values of fairness, professionalism, and respect for all. Ben took another deep breath and decided to meet with David Sterling to discuss the changes they needed to implement across the mall. The incident wasn't just an isolated event. It was a reflection of deeper issues in the training and attitudes of the staff. Ben knew that change had to start from the top down, and he was committed to ensuring that every employee at Crystal Haven Mall understood the importance of impartiality and excellent customer service. We need to implement mandatory training, Ben said as he sat across from David in his office. David nodded, his expression serious. I agree, Mr. Wallace. I think it's clear that there are some significant gaps in our staff's understanding of how to treat customers, David replied. Ben leaned back in his chair, his eyes thoughtful. It's not just about this one incident. We need to make sure that our staff are not allowing their personal biases to affect how they treat people. Everyone who walks through the doors of this mall deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of their beliefs or appearances. David nodded again, taking notes as Ben spoke. I'll work with HR to put together a comprehensive training program, he said. We'll make sure that every employee understands our expectations when it comes to professionalism and respect. Good, Ben said. I also want to implement a new customer respect policy that will be visible to both staff and patrons. It should serve as a reminder of the values we uphold in every one of our properties. David scribbled the idea down, a determined look on his face. We can have signs put up at all entrances and in staff areas. This way, it's always front and center for everyone, both customers and employees. Ben smiled slightly. Exactly. If we want to create a welcoming environment, it starts with setting clear expectations and holding everyone accountable. The new customer respect policy would be a key part of making that change. Ben wanted it to be known that his malls were places where all customers, regardless of their political affiliations or backgrounds, could feel welcome and safe. This was not just about preventing incidents like the one he experienced. It was about creating a culture of mutual respect, which he believed was sorely lacking in many parts of society. As Ben and David continued to plan, David brought up an idea for an all-staff meeting. I think it would be helpful if you address the staff directly, he suggested. Hearing your perspective firsthand might make a bigger impact than just hearing it from me or reading it in an email. Ben paused, considering David's words. You're right, he said after a moment. I think it's important that they understand why this matters to me, not just because I'm the owner, but because I genuinely believe in creating a positive environment for everyone who works here and shops here. The all-staff meeting was scheduled for later that week, and Ben made sure to prepare his remarks carefully. When the day arrived, Ben stood at the front of a large meeting room, looking out at the faces of the employees. There were a range of expressions, some curious, some nervous, and some guarded. Ben knew that the recent incident had likely left many of them feeling uncertain about their jobs and their futures, and he wanted to address that directly. Thank you all for being here today, Ben began, his voice calm but firm. I wanted to take the time to speak with you because I believe what happened a few days ago is something we can all learn from. As you may have heard, I was the individual who was asked to leave the mall simply because I was wearing a hat that represented my beliefs. He paused, letting his words sink in. There were murmurs from the crowd, and Ben could see the recognition on many of their faces. He continued, I want to be very clear about something. This is not about whether you agree with my beliefs or not. It's about how we treat people who may be different from us, how we treat our customers and each other. Ben could see Jenny and Mike standing at the back of the room, their expressions serious as they listened. He made a point to catch their eyes and give them a slight nod. We have to be better, Ben said, his voice carrying through the room. We have to hold ourselves to the highest standards of professionalism and respect. This mall and every property in our portfolio should be a place where everyone feels welcome. That means setting aside our personal biases and doing our jobs with integrity. There was a silence that hung in the air after Ben finished speaking, and he could see that his words were resonating with many of the employees. He hoped that they understood that this wasn't just about avoiding trouble or avoiding getting fired. It was about creating a positive culture, one that would benefit everyone who walked through the doors of Crystal Haven Mall. After the meeting, Ben felt a sense of cautious optimism. The new training programs were already being developed, and the customer respect policy was in the process of being finalized. He knew that changing a culture wasn't something that happened overnight, but he was committed to making it happen step by step. David had the signs printed and placed at strategic locations throughout the mall. The signs were simple but effective, with a message that read, At Crystal Haven Mall, we respect all customers. We are committed to providing a welcoming environment for everyone, regardless of their beliefs or backgrounds. The policy wasn't just for show, it was a commitment that Ben intended to uphold at all costs. He wanted his malls to be places where divisiveness had no home, where every person could shop, work, and spend time without fear of judgment or mistreatment. Ben felt a sense of accomplishment as he looked at the new signs and considered the upcoming training sessions. It was just the beginning, but it was a step in the right direction. He knew that by setting clear expectations and holding people accountable, he could create the kind of environment that he had always envisioned for his properties. And so, Ben introduced the new customer respect policy at all of his malls, emphasizing professionalism and impartiality. This was more than just a policy. It was a statement of the values that Ben believed in, and a commitment to making sure that Crystal Haven Mall and every mall he owned lived up to those values. A month after the incident at Crystal Haven Mall, Ben Wallace decided it was time to revisit the property. The past few weeks had been filled with training sessions, meetings, and the implementation of the new customer respect policy. Ben wanted to see the impact of these changes firsthand. He hoped that the environment at the mall had shifted towards one of respect and professionalism, where all patrons felt welcome. As Ben entered the mall, he immediately noticed a difference. The atmosphere seemed lighter, and the staff members appeared more attentive and engaged. He could see security officers Mike and Jenny at their usual posts, but their demeanor seemed more open and welcoming. They exchanged polite greetings with customers, and there was a sense of calm that Ben hadn't seen during his previous visit. Ben made his way to the information desk, where he was greeted warmly by a young employee who smiled and asked if she could assist him. He introduced himself, and she nodded, recognizing his name. "Mr. Wallace, it's great to have you back at Crystal Haven Mall," she said. "If there's anything you need, just let us know." Ben smiled and thanked her. He continued his walk through the mall, noting the new signs displaying the customer respect policy at each entrance and in various staff areas. The signs were visible, and their message was clear. Everyone was welcome, and everyone deserved to be treated with respect. Ben felt a sense of pride seeing the changes come to life. He made his way to the food court, where he decided to sit for a while and observe. He watched as families walked by, children excitedly pointing out different stores, and groups of friends laughing together as they enjoyed their time at the mall. The atmosphere was what he had always envisioned, a place where people could come together, regardless of their differences. David Sterling joined Ben at the table, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Ben, taking a seat beside him. "You know, I think things are really starting to change around here," David said, his tone optimistic. "The staff has taken the new training to heart, and I've seen a noticeable shift in how they interact with customers." Ben nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "I can see that too. It's good to know that the message is getting through. It's not just about avoiding incidents like the one we had. It's about creating a culture where respect is the default." David smiled. "I think we're getting there. It's not perfect, but it's progress. And honestly, I think the staff appreciated hearing directly from you. It made a difference." Ben looked around the food court, his gaze landing on Mike and Jenny, who were standing nearby, speaking with a shopper who appeared to be asking for directions. There was a genuine warmth in their interaction, and Ben felt a sense of satisfaction. He knew that both officers had learned from the experience and were committed to doing better. As Ben sat there, Laura Williams walked past the food court. She recognized Ben immediately, her face turning red with embarrassment. She quickly averted her eyes and walked in the opposite direction, clearly hoping to avoid any interaction. Ben noticed her but chose not to react. He wasn't interested in making her feel uncomfortable. He simply wanted her and everyone else to learn from what had happened. David followed Ben's gaze and chuckled softly. "It looks like not everyone is thrilled to see you," he said, then shrugged. "It's not about being liked, David. It's about setting the right example. People need to understand that actions have consequences, but they also need to be given the opportunity to learn and grow. That's all I'm trying to do here." David nodded in agreement. "Well, I think you've done a great job. The new policies are a step in the right direction, and I think the staff is finally starting to understand what we stand for." Ben smiled. "Sometimes the best way to teach a lesson is through actions, not words. I want this mall and all of my properties to reflect the values I believe in: respect, professionalism, and fairness. If we can achieve that, then I think we're on the right path." As the afternoon wore on, Ben decided to take a final walk through the mall before heading out. He stopped by a few of the stores, speaking briefly with employees, and was pleased to hear positive feedback about the changes. Many of them mentioned feeling more confident in their roles, knowing that the new training had given them a better understanding of how to handle difficult situations with professionalism and respect. Ben's final stop was the mall's main office, where he met with the new interim manager, a young, enthusiastic woman named Rachel, who had stepped in after Sarah's departure. Rachel greeted Ben with a bright smile, her excitement evident as she spoke about her plans for the mall. "Mr. Wallace, I just want to say thank you for the opportunity," Rachel said. "I think we're really moving in a great direction, and I'm excited to be a part of it." Ben shook her hand, his smile genuine. "I'm glad to hear that, Rachel. I have high hopes for this mall, and I'm confident that with your leadership, we can make it the kind of place where everyone feels welcome. As Ben left Crystal Haven Mall that day, he felt a sense of closure. The incident that had started it all was now firmly in the past, but the lessons learned would continue to shape the future. He knew that the changes they had made were just the beginning, and there was still work to be done. But he was proud of the progress they had made, and he was determined to keep moving forward. Before you go, we'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced unfair treatment based on an assumption? Share your story in the comments. If you enjoyed this tale of justice and leadership, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more inspiring stories.